Thank you, Leslie. You can see why I quit television now. How many of you have ever heard the program that I do? Oh, wonderful. And I hope you have been able to hear Budd, who's been on many times. He is just fabulous. And Leslie and her work with the Kecksburg incident you saw on the Sci-Fi Channel, many of you, she's one of the great ones. So I don't do public appearances. I'm really honored to be able to live in this area. I don't tell anybody, so don't you tell anybody. I keep it real quiet for, I think, obvious reasons. It's kind of a high-profile business, and it's not something that a lot of people in strange places appreciate, so we keep it quiet. How many of you know a lot about Budd Hopkins? I mean, a lot. Are you pretty well versed? How many of you don't know too much about him, but you've heard really important things about him? Good. Well, let me, if I may, and just indulge me, I want to read a little bit of this background because it's important. He is, and this is just really skimming the surface. Is this loud enough? You hear me okay? Budd Hopkins is not only a great researcher, but he's a world-renowned artist, and there's some of his artworks back there on the back table. He has shows in New York City. He expresses himself in a very unique way. Take a look and you'll see. He's a very talented man. He's an author and obviously a pioneer UFO abduction researcher, having investigated well over 700 cases. Now this is one-on-one. These are personal investigations. These aren't just picking up a book or a newspaper or a magazine. I mean, the man is a hands-on investigator, and that's so important now. He has his organization called the Intruders Foundation. You can find that on the internet. It's a wonderful location to stop, spend some time. That's a nonprofit scientific research and support organization, accent on support. Bud first became interested in the UFO phenomenon when he and two others had a daylight UFO sighting in Massachusetts back in 1964. In 1975, he carried out his first major investigation, which involved a UFO landing and occupant incident in North Hudson Park, New Jersey. Shortly thereafter, he began to concentrate on the investigation of the UFO abduction phenomenon in particular, which led to the eventual publication of a number of very important findings. Taken together in his 4 books now, it's got 3 here, Missing Time in 1981, Intruders in 1987, and Witnessed in 1996. They are widely regarded by researchers and skeptics, real skeptics, not the phony skeptics, as being the most influential series of books yet published on the abduction phenomenon. His newest book, brilliantly titled Sight Unseen, is on the back table, and he will sign that for you later on tonight. Bud was on talking about that some months ago, and that it's taken a long time for him to produce 4 books. He doesn't throw them out like a lot of people. They're very important, and this is probably his best. He is a prolific writer and internationally respected painter, as I mentioned. He has delivered countless lectures on the UFO and abduction phenomenon around the country and around the world. His book, Missing Time, was the very first book to compare a number of UFO abduction cases in order to isolate the patterns that they revealed. And that's one thing Bud does. He looks for trends and patterns and then builds on that. He's just extraordinary the way he goes about his research. Despite its rather controversial nature, Bud's research has received serious commentary in such mainstream publications as Time, Paris Match, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, Omni, People, and on and on. He's been on most every major radio and television talk show you can think of over the years. His contribution is extraordinary. For me, throughout 11 years now of doing the work I do on radio, I've had the pleasure, as you might imagine, of interviewing literally thousands of people, some extraordinary people from all over the world. They represent disciplines that are almost endless. They go on and on and on. But let me say without the slightest hesitation or doubt that tonight's guest is without question one of the most extraordinary people I've ever had the pleasure of spending time with on the radio. Budd Hopkins is truly unique. Not only has he earned a worldwide audience and worldwide respect as the, in my view, premier abduction researcher on the planet, but beyond that, Budd Hopkins stands as a paragon of kindness, of dedication, and total commitment to the people who have made their way to him seeking help and some answers for what they have been forced to endure. Budd Hopkins is a credit to his field, to be sure, but more than that, I think Budd Hopkins is a credit to this species that we call human. I've been able to introduce very few people in my life, and I'm glad to be here tonight. We've spent many conversations, Budd and I, on national radio. We've talked in private. We're going to have lunch tomorrow. I'm very blessed to have had him as a guest, and I think more blessed than that to count Budd Hopkins as a friend. And now let me get out of the way and introduce to you the one and the only Budd Hopkins.
Thank you, man. This is going to be a tough introduction to live up to. I'm going to try to live up to even a tiny bit of it. But the first thing I'd like to say is how pleased I am really to be here. I live in New York City, and you know, us New Yorkers are kind of snobbish and ill-educated about the rest of the world. And when I heard that an old friend of mine in the field, Michael Bryan, was living here, and when I realized that this is where JEFF RENSE was living, and that Jordan Peace lived here, and that a number of people who I've known well have come up here, I thought, Ashland, what is that? Where is that? This little place in the middle of nowhere. Well, I happened to be driving up here today from Sacramento, and I was unbelievably staggered by the beauty of this place. It was just incredible. I just was thrilled. I kept getting beeped by the trucks behind me because I was going 20 miles an hour on the road. I didn't want to miss anything. So I'm extremely pleased to, first, to discover your absolutely beautiful part of the country. And I'm ashamed of the fact that I didn't know anything about it before. And I want to come back. I want to thank, of course, immediately Jordan for doing such a wonderful job of producing these programs and bringing people together, and to introduce subjects which are kind of difficult for a lot of people. Because something seems difficult or quote-unquote unbelievable does not mean that it isn't taking place. And the UFO phenomenon itself and the abduction phenomenon within it is one of those subjects, really, the abduction phenomenon in particular, that people regard as impossible, can't be, crazy. And I remember when I had my sighting in 1964 and saw this thing flying around, the farthest thing from my mind, this is in the daytime, of course, with other people, the farthest thing from my mind was that inside that thing were intelligences. I could see it as a piece of equipment or something up there hanging down on a string or something. And of course the idea that they were interested in us, human beings, was beyond the pale. It was scary, but I couldn't accept it. And when the Betty and Barney Hill report came out back in 1966, I thought, ridiculous, can't be. And I had a very good reason for saying can't be. It's just that I could not accept that possibility. My mind stopped. And to show you one quick thing about how hard it's been for people to accept this, back in the days, in the early days of investigations, and people were interested in sightings of craft, but not the idea that there were, God forbid, occupants, or that they were interested in us. It was all kind of technology. It was a Cold War mentality. There was an article in a report in a journal, I believe the Nightcap Journal, about a man who was driving along on his motorcycle at night, going down a dark road, and this huge craft came down above the motorcycle and was pacing him, 50 feet up, and he was terrified. He's going faster and faster, trying to escape it. Now, we didn't have a complete report here, so we didn't know what actually happened, but I can assure you, from what I know now, if I'd looked into that report at the time, I would have asked a lot of questions about, did he get home a little late that night? Was there something more that he could not remember? Has he had dreams about it subsequently, etc.? In other words, they don't just come down and buzz. But the writer of the article had it figured out. He said he assumed that this craft was trying to find out the top speed of a Harley Davidson. Well, they got faster things than Harley Davidsons. They're not too concerned. Now, what I'm going to do tonight is several things. I want to review some of the physical evidence in terms of slides, so some implants that have been turned up on x-rays, some of the physical marks on people, UFO photographs, and so on. And we'll go into the material that I covered in Sight Unseen. After we take the break, I'm going to show you about a 10 or 12 minute videotape on a wholly different aspect of the phenomenon, and that is a videotape of an investigation I did about a UFO that crashed in, I believe, 1963. I've forgotten the exact date now, in New Mexico. This was not Roswell, this was many years later. The basic theme of this, it's a work in progress, this documentary on the case, is a woman who at the time was a medical technician at this little hospital in northern New Mexico. And she responded to an ambulance call of a crash, went to the scene. There were 2 state police cars parked there and troopers. And when she got out of the ambulance, there were 3 little bodies. And she said, "Where are their parents?" And he said, "I don't think we have parents here. This is something I think we're going to have to report to the Air Force." And you will see her describing what happened and how she picked up with her assistant, the driver, 3 little alien bodies, took them back to the hospital. This isn't something she glimpsed through a doorway. She was there handling these things. She tried to get a vital bodily sign and so forth. It's a graphic story, and you know, you can make up your own mind about her credibility, but it's the only crash retrieval case I've become involved in. It's extremely interesting. We're going to hold that until after the break, and that keeps everybody from running home, you know, in between. Now, the first thing I want to do is show you a short videotape. We'll get into this in just a minute. The issue here is, of course, since a lot of people have video cameras nowadays, there are many, many videotapes of craft, many of which are just a dot of light, and therefore extremely difficult to tell anything about. My friend, Dr. Bruce Maccabee, an optical physicist who works for the Navy Department, he's done a lot of analysis, and he did a thorough study of this particular object, which was, believe it or not, kind of egg-shaped, peanut-shaped. It was an odd-shaped thing. And the origin of this film was a man named Frank, who was a corrections officer for the state of New York, went out into his backyard and saw this thing passing overhead, ran pretty high up, ran in, got his video camera, and filmed it very quickly. And this is the interesting part. His wife was out in the near him planting some flowers, and he said nothing to her about what he was doing. You know, anybody would say, "Hey, look at this thing." Nothing. He was in a strange, I believe, kind of altered state. What he remembers next is putting down the video camera, walking very slowly into the house. The video camera's running for a while. He puts the video camera away and goes into the kitchen and does not remember what happened for the next 4 hours. And it took him a week to remember, oh, didn't I videotape a UFO? And to get out the tape and look at this thing. Well, ultimately, as we looked into it, and there's much more to the case, what turned up was when he went into the kitchen, he was standing there and all of a sudden lifted straight up, went straight through the roof of the kitchen. This is in a neighborhood. And right into this peanut-shaped object, which was maybe 100 feet up. Now, how this bears on the issue of invisibility, which I'm going to be talking about just a little bit later, is that this craft was absolutely visible to begin with when he filmed it. But at the time, perhaps a minute or two later, that he was taken inside it, clearly it was invisible because there were neighbors around, there were cars on the street, nobody saw the craft 100 feet above his house, nobody saw him go straight up through on a beam of light or anything like that. So it switched from one kind of state of being to another, from visibility to invisibility. Now, we're going to, if we can have the lights, we're going to look at this very, very brief bit of tape. And this tape will show him doing a slow motion version of the craft. It goes behind clouds, and then it passes past the church. He's going to, I believe, replay it. The fact that there are reference points is very important. You see it again? And then a very short thing to give you a slightly better look. This is a second or third generation film. I've seen the original and I've seen still photographs. And it's very clear its shape as it moves in and out of the clouds. And of course, knowing something about the weather at the time, we could tell how high up the thing was because it was behind the clouds. He loses it, and then it reappears. It's a bird going by, not to be alarmed. You see the distinct peanut shape, which is very odd. Okay, if we can end the video, and I'd like to turn on the slides, and we have a couple of stills here. If our first slide goes on here. Not going.
Can you tell the house lights?
There we go. Okay, you can have the lights back. This is these are some stills that he made of the object in two different positions from his videotape, showing the shape of the thing. And if we could have the next slide. This is the kitchen area where this is the area where the thing disappeared, excuse me, with the steeple, a church steeple in the background. Let's go back one slide if we can reverse it back to this. Now, there's a final end to the story, which is quite wonderful. Frank is himself a lapsed Roman Catholic, although his wife is still rather religious. And Dr. Maccabee asked Frank, as he was doing his complex analysis of the photograph, he asked Frank to find out how tall the steeple was of the church, because it was going to be very important in his calculations. And Frank said, well, how am I going to do that? And he said, well, go in and ask the priest how tall the steeple is. Frank was very hesitant, not having been in the church for a while, but he decided to bite the bullet and go in, and he said he was ushered finally into a priest's office, and he was determined he wasn't going to say why he had to know that. But of course, it's a bizarre question. He asked the priest, who he said was, he thought, a rather unpleasant gentleman behind an extremely ornate, imposing desk. And the man asked, naturally, why do you have to know how tall the steeple is, how tall the church? And he said, well, decided he had to tell the truth. And he said, well, I filmed a UFO recently that passed behind the steeple, and the analysis, we have to know how tall the steeple is to get calculations. And the priest looked at him and leaned back in his chair, according to him, and roared and laughed and said, surely you don't believe in such things as UFOs. And he said, well, yes, I do. He said, and Frank said to the priest, I take it you believe in God and Jesus and the Virgin Mary. And the priest said, yes. And he said, got any pictures? I've got pictures. At any rate, if we can have the next slide, and the following slide. Now, what I want to do is show you something of some of the photographic and physical evidence. This is very, very hard to tell anything. This is the kind of slide that I get, photographs I get sent. This is a parking lot. Up in the upper right, which I'm afraid is out of the picture here for some reason, is a little group of dots. And the next slide, please, will show, when we blew it up, what they look like. This was something I had done when I took the photograph itself. This was an incident that happened in, I believe, Georgia. Probably about 10 years ago. Now, interestingly, we have a lot of cases where we have objects in formation like this, and very often it's a kind of a circular form or even a delta form with one behind, and there seems to be a perfect circle of light. Now, just to show how these things turn up, next slide, please. This is a photograph that was taken in Gulf Breeze, Florida, which has a very similar shape of light underneath, a circular light. It was not all that far from where this particular incident happened. And the thing is that this photograph and others taken at the time were taken by a Polaroid camera. So you get the actual originals are very dark. But when a lot of light is shined on the Polaroid prints, and a time exposure is made of the Polaroid so you can see detail, this is what you get. With the next slide, please. Now, you know, there's this myth that we don't have any kind of decent photographs. We don't, but if you imagine that ring of light on the bottom being very similar to those rings that we're passing over in that formation, you get one particular style of UFO, which is commonly reported. Next slide, please. Now, the issue of how people report the aliens. Unfortunately, this kind of head is on every T-shirt and cereal box and signet ring and God knows what nowadays. But these are drawings made almost 20 years ago when it was not so well known. This is a drawing made by Kathy Davis, who I wrote about in my book, Intruders. Intruders, you may know, my second book was the book that was made into a quite successful miniseries on CBS. It was very well done. At any rate, she made this drawing, and these faces were not well known then. If I can have the next slide, please. Meanwhile, another person who was having abduction experiences made this drawing, and when Kathy Davis, the woman who made the first drawing, saw this drawing later, she thought it was her own drawing. We can have the next slide. Because they were so similar. And there is a phenomenon here in abduction research which we call confirmation anxiety. And that's when a person finds something that confirms their experience, there is a tremendous kind of upset, as if they didn't really want something that would make it seem true to them. And Kathy Davis, who made the drawing on the right, told me that after she saw this drawing, and it was reproduced in a magazine, and had first thought it was hers and realized it wasn't, but it was so similar, she said, I was so upset, Bud, I went upstairs and I went into the bathroom and I threw up. Next slide, please. Now, these kinds of drawings I'm showing you are all in the area of 20 years ago. Before this was, I'm not showing you anything recent, before these faces were familiar. And in many cases, you get a drawing like this, which is more of insect-like. And the point I'd like you to bear in mind here, first of all, is always this very thin neck, very large head. But this is a rather odd creature. But if you look at the very pointed chin, the huge eyes, and the almost total absence of nose, and you imagine that head turning into a strict profile. Look at the next slide. This is a drawing made by another person in another case of the strict profile, very similar to the thing we've just seen. Now, the congruence of all of these drawings, of the reports, of everything that happens during abductions and so forth, means that something is happening that has distinct edges to it. It's not some soft, vague, uncertain thing. There's a precision here. Next slide, please. Now, what we get in terms of physical marks after abduction experiences take place are marks like this. This is on a little 5-year-old boy. It came up after just overnight after the child had had apparently an abduction experience. His father has one in the same place on the lower leg. But these are what we call scoop marks. This is a very circular one. Sometimes they're more oval. This is rather small. I've seen them as big as my thumbnail. But we believe that the UFO occupants are taking flesh samples as a way of perhaps doing the kinds of research that they do with genetics, with trying to establish the basic genetic makeup of a particular person and perhaps altering that in some way. Next slide. We don't know for sure. This is a very small one on someone's lower leg in front. These are extremely clear and distinct. There's nothing vague about them. And I have seen hundreds and hundreds of them. Next slide. Now, this is a case in Australia. This was a nurse, actually, who had this almost a kind of scoop mark at one end, and then there's a straight line cut coming out of it. And this is something that was inflicted on her when she was a tiny baby. And her parents discovered this. There was no bleeding. She was only about 3 months old. And it healed as this very large mark. And she has had a lifetime of experiences since. So we're getting physical marks. These are things you can photograph, that people remember what the, shall we say, perpetrators look like. There are physical marks on them, that case after case, that are extraordinarily similar. Next slide. Now, this is a straight line cut on the back of the leg, and we get many like that. There's often a kind of depression. This happened when this, a typical case, a girl went into the woods at a party when she was a picnic, family picnic. She was about 15. And she remembers in the woods meeting this beautiful deer. The deer came over to her and had these big, black, soulful eyes, and she remembered having a kind of conversation with the deer. And when she came out of the woods, she found out her family had been searching for her for 2 hours. She thought she'd been in the woods for maybe 5 minutes. And she kept telling people about the deer, which didn't make sense. And then, of course, she noticed, or somebody noticed, this cut on the back of her leg. And she had no idea how it had occurred. These are just typical kinds of things that happen. Next slide, please. And this is an Australian case where there were 3 different automobiles which were stopped late at night, stopped by some interference with their electrical system, apparently. The people were taken out of the cars. They just, actually, they found themselves getting out of the cars and walking out into this field where this craft lingered. And they remembered being taken towards the craft. Their conscious memories more or less end there. The next thing they remember, because there's this blotting out of the memory, the next thing they were aware of, they're going back to their cars, the craft is gone. But each one of the actually 5 people who were involved in this had a ring like this around both ankles. No one knows exactly what this was for. This is rather rare, but it implied some kind of clamping device, although that's just an inference. We don't really know. I'm giving you some idea of the range of some of the physical traces on people's bodies after these experiences. Next slide. Now, this is another much more complex situation. The idea of implants. This is an X-ray. I think the next slide will show it better, a little closer. You can see the object in the nasal cavity, high up. This object was X-rayed. The woman involved, Linda Cortila, who I wrote about in my book, Witnessed. That was my 3rd book. She remembered going to a doctor because she had found a scar in her nose. And she didn't know what was the matter. She felt there was a kind of a bump on the outside. Went to the doctor, and he asked her what kind of surgery she had had. And she said, I've never had any surgery. At any rate, when an X-ray was done years later, this object turned up. And shortly after the X-ray was done, she found herself awakening at night with blood streaming out of that right nostril. And when we had her X-rayed again, there was a scar, but no longer an object. Next slide, please. Now, this is a very interesting case, and it's even in a certain sense more important because of the location of the object. The object is towards the top of the head on the left side. You can see a sort of a whitish, squarish form. I hope you can see it. It's on the right at about, I suppose, 10:30 or 11 o'clock. This was a little girl who had been having experiences. She was afraid to go into her room at night. She said people came through the wall and took her away. Her parents were very frightened and didn't know what was happening. And on a vacation trip, the family was in Germany, the man was in the army, a vacation trip to Italy, the little girl had an accident on a bicycle. And she was taken to the hospital, and they were x-raying her head to see if she had fractured herself. And this small object turned up. Now, this first view is looking more or less down at the top of the head. Now, the second slide, next slide, will show the looking up from the bottom. And where this object is now in its location is in the bottom of the eye socket on the left. You can see it there. So we can locate this two-dimensionally at least now. Now the next slide will show where it is in the middle of the head. I've had these photographs looked at by, these x-rays, by a neurosurgeon who said, Bud, that's a piece of metal in there, and there's no way it can be taken out. And he said, I don't know how in the world it got there. The interesting thing was, after this little girl was taken back to her home in Army base in Germany, they took her to another doctor, re-x-rayed her, and the thing had disappeared. It's gone. But there are many cases of this. I have reports from radiologists and other x-ray material and so on, where an object is inside the skull. We have no idea what it's for. We don't know how they get it in and out without leaving marks, unless it perhaps goes in through the nasal cavity or something of that sort. But I just want you to understand the wide range of physical data of one kind or another that supports the reality of these experiences. Next slide. Now we're getting into something else. This is the issue of invisibility. And this is something that I've written about extensively. As I said at the beginning, dealing with that peanut-shaped craft that could be filmed 1 minute and invisibly involved in an abduction the next minute, this is a very interesting case. Well, I happened to be in Australia, and after I gave a lecture, a couple came up to me. They were quite nervous, and the man, you sort of sense the ill-at-ease quality and the uncertainty in someone. They don't know what's happened to them. They want to find out. It's upsetting to them. And they came over, and the man was really a little too nervous to talk. His wife said that they felt that a lot of things had happened to them involving their two sons and so forth. And she went into some of the experiences. And then she said, have you ever seen anything like these? And held out these photographs. This is the first one. Next slide, please. And this is the second one. And I said, well, they're all, of course, in the red range. I said, was this color film you were using? I didn't really understand what the problem was. And she said, yes, it's color film. And she said, these were taken 7 years ago or something, and or perhaps more, longer ago than that. And she said the photographs before these particular pictures, which were taken on a Saturday afternoon in a playground, the photographs before that and after these three were all normal in color, but these three were that looked like this. Now, I said, well, I don't understand what that, did something funny happen there, or why are you bringing it up? And she said, well, we just felt very strange that day. But she said, the problem isn't the red color. She said, it's the fact that we're supposed to be in these pictures and we're not there. See the next slide, please? Now, how anybody would take a picture like this by itself. Anyway, the basic point here, let's go back to the one before, if we may. The basic point is that they developed these pictures and they weren't in them. When I asked more questions about that afternoon, they had taken their two little boys who were on the slides and swings at the beginning, that first shot. Everybody was having a good time, and then they began to feel strange. And as they sort of walked out towards the water, this is in Brisbane, or nearby, they took a couple more pictures, and then they felt very odd, and the kids wanted to go home. She said this was their favorite place. This is a playground only a few miles from their house, and the children loved to go there. Never wanted to go back, ever. Well, that's something for the child in a nearby playground. But she said we both felt very eerie and strange. So one thing led to another. It's a complex story, and I persuaded the wife to do a hypnotic regression session with me on this particular incident. And what happened, her husband was not there when we did the session. She went through the whole thing of taking the pictures, wandering around, you know, everything's normal. And at the end, the last picture, her husband took the camera, and under hypnosis, she's recalling where she was standing, and she had a little child on one side, one on the other. She remembered who was on the left and who was on the right. And all of a sudden, she describes all of this light around her. Now, this is daytime, no problem. Saturday afternoon, a lot of people around. And all of a sudden, she said, "We're going up." And she described going up with great fear into this, in this beam of light, into this craft. She could see it above her. They were taken inside, she and the two boys. Her husband was left below, and when she was going up, she could see him standing there, holding the camera up to his head, as if he's still taking the picture, but in a certain sense frozen. And she's taken one way inside the craft by the occupants, and the two little boys are taken another direction to another room, and she was in enormous fear and anxiety for her children. And we went through this part of the whole thing rather quickly. Ultimately, after the kinds of operations that usually take place and procedures, she was reunited with the children back in the craft, and they went back down through an opening in the bottom of the craft, which is interesting when you think of those circles of light in some of the UFO photographs. They went down the center of the craft, and as they went down, she could see her husband still standing there holding the camera. At this point, she gets to the ground, and all of a sudden, she doesn't remember any of this, and she and the children walk over to her husband, who takes the camera down, and they all feel like they want to go home. Well, the next day I was able to do hypnosis with the husband, and she was very anxious to hear whether such an absolutely absurd story, as she felt it was, that she was telling me, even though she remembered it extremely vividly, whether it was true or not, whether it be confirmed. With her husband, we did the hypnotic session. It's a long story. I go into this at some length in Sight Unseen in my new book. But at any rate, as he's taking the picture, all of a sudden he says, "They're going up." And he's extremely upset, and he says, "They don't even look surprised," as if they're kind of frozen with whatever expression they have. And he's still holding the camera. And so I questioned him. I said, "Well, imagine you put the camera down to your side and call for help." That's a lead, of course. "No," he said, "I can't move." And I said, "Well, I imagine people come over to you after a while, just standing there holding the camera, focused on nothing. They must come over to you and ask if they can help." He said, "I don't think they can even see me." So at some point, as we have discovered in so many cases, it seems that the UFO itself can become unseeable. The beam of light or whatever tractor device is used to get people into the craft is unseeable. The people themselves are unseeable, and the aliens are unseeable. And the whole thing, of course, can explain this idea of invisibility, why in all of these cases that I've looked into, abductions which have taken place in New York City, I had somebody taken to the 22nd floor of a building next door to the Museum of Modern Art at the middle of the night, but there's still people all over the place. Cases of abductions in Rome, in Paris, in Pakistan, you name it. I've explored these cases. Somebody was taken off a balcony of a Holiday Inn in Hollywood, California in the daytime. There was a wedding going on in the courtyard below. Floated right up into the craft. Now, this could not happen if these things could be seen. And so there is some kind of technology of invisibility which the UFO occupants have developed, which means they can operate with impunity almost any place. They can float somebody through a closed surface, a window, a wall, whatever. They can render that person invisible and the whole operation invisible, and the person is returned. I've had cases where a child is taken from a house, just vanishes, in a neighborhood where, in the daytime, when things should be seen. The police are called. The police are running around searching the neighborhood. The neighbors are around. The parents are tearing their hair and crying and weeping, and all of a sudden the little girl comes walking out of the house. What was the fuss? Well, where were you? Well, I was playing in my room the way I always do. No, you weren't. We searched the house. You know, the police searched the house. I was there the whole time. The little child doesn't remember what happens. Only odd feelings begin to come back. And just as I mentioned in the case of the girl who went into the woods and thought she was talking to a beautiful deer, and under hypnosis that deer turned into be not a deer but a little man with no hair and black eyes. This idea of a screen memory can be sort of implanted in the mind of the abductee, and this little girl said, no, I was here playing, and she might even have a memory of how they were playing, except that she was missing, and the whole town was looking for her, so to speak. These things are off the wall when you think about them, that kind of invisibility. But it means that this whole procedure, this whole entire alien interest in human beings can be carried on in a totally covert way. Now, before we get to the break here, I'd like to tell you about another recent case I've been working with and play a little of the hypnotic regression I did with this man. And this case has its own sort of touching and almost amusing aspects. Let's just see next slide after that again, and we'll finish the slides. And I think the next might be it. Oh, sorry. Another area which we have to go into before we go into that. This is the idea of, I was so dazzled by the scenery that I forgot about this. This is the issue of the production of what we're now calling transgenic beings, the idea of a hybrid mix of alien makeup and alien characteristics and human characteristics. For years, we had no idea why abductions were taking place. What was the purpose of this? If they need to know about human beings, why did they take hundreds upon thousands? And why did they take the same person often again and again and again? And what we learned, and I wrote about in my book, Intruders, and which has been virtually accepted and confirmed by, as far as I know, every other researcher in the field, in abduction research, is that during these abductions, tissue samples are taken, ova and sperm samples are taken, and the basic goal seems to be, on the part of the aliens, to create some kind of a mix, a genetic mix of alien and human characteristics. Many, many people have been taken into the craft, have been shown a small child or a tiny baby or something as small as this, and I have several people have described holding a little tiny fetus or whatever in their hand, was handed to them by the aliens. There seems to be this attempt to take human and alien characteristics and make a new species, a new kind of being. And it's being done apparently by not the hybrid procedure by which you can make a mule by crossing a horse and a donkey, but which is very rare in the real world, and it's sterile, so it can't reproduce itself. But this is by taking a gene here and a gene there, and designer genes, one might say, and creating what they want as a mix. And this seems to be a long-term series of procedures and operations which has not yet been codified absolutely. But in our book, Sight Unseen, my co-author, my wife, Carol Rainey, has done a great deal of research into the science that's going on right now in earthly terms that begins to validate, to some extent, these alien characteristics, even the idea of invisibility. But I'm sure some of you have heard about the experiment that was done when a gene from a jellyfish was implanted in the genetic makeup of a rabbit. And the result is a rabbit which is carrying the jellyfish gene successfully, and under a black light, the rabbit glows an eerie green. Now, if we can do things like this, if we can pick and choose and somehow successfully, and actually total breeds have been mixed, goats and sheep, I believe, have been intermixed. If we can do this, the aliens can make this kind of thing happen, surely with human DNA, human genetic properties and their own. Our book is really a handling of the scientific background of all of these different case reports, which seem totally extraordinary. But I want to show you just a few pictures of what some of these beings look like. This was an obstetrical nurse remembered during an abduction being shown this child, and the aliens often in these cases want the human to bond with the child, to hold the child, as if they believe, which is a very touching thing when you think about it, as if they believe that there is some kind of magic in the human touch, that the human touch will somehow give these babies strength. And as we all know from our human species, is the syndrome of the failure to thrive, the fact that children seem to need the warmth and closeness, physical closeness of the mother and some kind of support in order to make it, to live. And the aliens seem to understand that in some strange way. But when she was shown this figure that she was being asked to hold, she said she was appalled. She made this drawing. She said that she knew that this thing was not going to be able to live because the head was too big, the neck would not support it, the mouth seemed to have no musculature, there could be no suckling, and she thought that it should not be allowed to live. I'm sorry, I have the print backwards here. And the alien who was handing it this child took it back away from her and seemed to be somewhat angry that she was rejecting it, and she was told then, we'll find other things for you to do. But one of the qualities that turns up in these drawings over and over again, first of all, are eyes that are too large, often black, but sometimes with no iris or pupil. But sometimes there's a very large blue iris. Blue seems to be the color that comes through. And the hair is very thin, doesn't really evenly cover the scalp, and seems irregular, as if the genes for hair have not been really mastered somehow, although that may happen in some other cases. Next slide, please. This is a little model made by a woman who was given this child to hold, and she felt it was, she's being made to feel it was her child in some way. Now, whether it really was in the sense that she contributed some kinds of cells or not, we don't know. But in many abduction accounts, a woman is abducted, some sort of procedure takes place in the abdomen, as if there is a sampling of ova, sometimes with needle marks left and very painful memories and whatnot. And ultimately, the woman will find herself at another later stage pregnant, without, in some cases, having even been sexually active, and very confused and befuddled and worried, and 3 months later, after another odd experience, the woman has another remembered abduction experience, and she's suddenly no longer pregnant, and there's no sign of any kind of miscarriage. I have 2 cases that I go into in the book to some extent about women who lost a child in the 7th month, and the baby disappeared, absolutely disappeared. And she went to the doctor the next day with her mother. There was no sign, and the 7th-month miscarriage would be a major medical problem. She went with her mother to the doctor, and there was no fetal heartbeat, there was no fetal tissue, and it just became a total mystery. In one case, a woman actually sued her doctor for malpractice, lost the suit because she could prove nothing that the doctor had done wrong. It's just that the baby disappeared. Well, we don't know how these things work, but apparently this is a central aspect of the entire phenomenon. Next slide, please. This is a drawing made by Kathy Davis, who I wrote about in Intruders. This is the child that she remembered being shown when she was a little girl. The child was a little girl. She was, this is after a disappeared pregnancy. She felt that this child was perhaps 4 or 5 years old. The head was too large. The eyes were very large and blue. The hair was very scraggly and very pale, almost a white blonde. Did not cover the whole head. And she felt enormous affection and love for this child. Some women seemed repelled. It's a mixed kind of thing, but it seems that the UFO occupants want this kind of bonding. And I have to say that I worked with 3 different women, different times, who remember being shown this small child like this stage or younger. And all 3 women under hypnosis describing this child said, you know, her hair is sticking up. No one's taking care of her hair. It looks awful. Her hair is all just sticking around. She said, no one's brushing her hair. And then one woman said another time, you know, I don't think they understand hair. And of course, in a certain sense, that's the kind of remark that gives a very strong emotional resonance to the experience of being shown a little child whose hair doesn't look right and doesn't cover the head, as is the case here. Next slide. Now, we have a number of cases where abductees report seeing adults who seem to be partially human and partially alien. And in some of the cases, like this, again, we have black eyes rather than that large blue, but there's more of a nose, there's more of a human shape. The head is not so bulbous. But the irony is we have many cases where the people reporting these figures will say they look like they're wearing wigs, cheap wigs. Next slide. Here's another one. This is an Oregon case, as a matter of fact. And I guess the wigs come in different styles from different places. But there seems to be, behind this, an attempt to want to pass in the real world. And this is something I'll mention after the break. We'll get into that very briefly. If we can have the slides off now, and I want to go into, very quickly, and then we'll be having a break in a few minutes, a new case that I've been working on with a gentleman from England who is an extremely nice man. And I think if I go into this a little bit, it gives you a sense of the flavor of how these investigations take place. The man's experience was this. He's married. He is a massage therapist, extremely intelligent. He had noticed all through his life odd things happening from time to time, which didn't make sense. Lots of fears. Sometimes they seemed totally bizarre, ungrounded, unfounded. Also, nightmares, dreams coming back, flashbacks of images, but some of the pieces were missing. But one of the things that had happened to him that made him really think that this might be connected with UFO phenomenon because he had actually finally read something. It was only about 2 years ago that he finally read something about the subject. Was he said in his home in England, he went to sleep, and this whole thing is a very typical thing. He woke up, and he was standing in the backyard in his pajamas, and he thought, how did I get out here? I must have been sleepwalking. Must have been sleepwalking. So he turned to the back door, which was a big sliding glass door, to open it, and it was locked from the inside. It had some kind of little catch. You could not slide it. So he thought, this is unusual. I must have been sleepwalking, come out the front door and gone around the side. So I ran around to the front of the house, and the front door was locked. And he thought, well, I must have, these rationalizations we all develop. I must have somehow come out the door, and the door slammed and locked. So he woke his wife, rang the doorbell, threw some pebbles at the window. And she came down. He's standing there quite cold in his pajamas outside. And he said he heard her slide the bolt, the deadbolt on the front door, slide it open. And at that moment, he realized he could not have come out through the door either. He could not have come out through either door. And that triggered some partial memories, and he began to feel a sense of dread. And he said when his wife opened the door, at that point he burst into tears. He just said he couldn't. She said, what happened? How did you get here? And he could not stop crying. I've talked to his wife about this. She didn't know what was the matter, and she said, well, let's go upstairs. And they got into bed, and at that point she was so upset that he had to stop crying and protect her. She said, what is happening? What is going on? There had been other incidents in their lives which were equally upsetting and mysterious. What is the answer here? Well, at any rate, ultimately he contacted me. And he came over to the United States, about last spring. And I did some hypnotic regressions. But the story that was most interesting, and I'm going to play a little bit of hypnotic regression, is this, that when he was 16, he had a friend named John, and John was 17 or something. They worked together, and John and he were big fans of, I'm trying to think, David Bowie. They were big David Bowie fans. There was going to be a David Bowie television program, and so John said, my parents are away, so come on over. I'm going to have some guys in, and we can drink some beer and watch the program. So he went over there, and there were 4 or 5 other boys there who didn't know, never met before, and had never been to his friend John's house. They watched the program and everything. One of the boys got very drunk, and they had to take him home. He went. Then he was led by his friend into the bedroom where he was going to stay, which was his friend John's little sister's room. Under hypnosis, he described the room. He said, bed's very small. I have to take all the dolls off the bed to get in bed. The little girl had everything lined up, but she was away with the parents. Gets in bed. Now he slept nude. So he took his clothes off, got in bed, and when he woke up in the morning, he said he felt very strange, and he said the room didn't look right, and it looked dark. And he remembered these big windows. It was on the 3rd floor. And he thought, well, this is funny. He sees a stairway. He goes up the stairs and opens the door, and he's suddenly in the kitchen. And there's a woman in the kitchen who turns around and looks at him and screams, who are you? How did you get in here? Now, he was stark naked, wrapped up in a bedspread at this point, because he had no clothes. So here's this naked 16-year-old kid, not knowing how in the world he got there. He assumed that this woman must be his friend John's mother. And he said, well, John had me spend the night. He assumed she must have returned. She said, John who? And he gave the name of John's last name. And she said, this is not his house. She said, but my son knows his house, knows John. And a few minutes later, into the kitchen, everybody standing around completely confused, came her son, who was the drunken boy the night before. And he looks at him and says, how did you get here? Now, I have to explain, the 2 houses were 3 miles apart. It was March. He was naked. His clothes are back in the house that he'd gone to bed. How did he get there? What happened? He had terrible feelings about the whole thing, and somebody had to go to John's house and get his clothes. That was just one more of the many things that happened. But we did hypnosis on that, and if we can have the tape now, Jason, this is the middle of the hypnotic regression session, and I hope it's audible.
Down. It's curvy.
Curvy.
Shaped.
He's been examined.
I'll sit on it. I won't lie down on it. I'll sit on it. Oh, I'm not lying down.
I hope is this side B?
What's happening now?
Lifting my legs up. Okay. I'm lying down on the bed. Very smooth.
I think we're in the wrong place, Jordan. I'll tell you what. Let's just
The pan.
drop it, and I'll tell you what happens. I think I miscued this, but I'm very sorry for that. But the basic point is this: under hypnosis, what happened was he had gone to bed at John's house, and here were these big windows. Took off his clothes up on the 3rd floor. And then he wakes up, and he finds himself unable to move, and he's very frightened. And he realizes there's an enormous amount of light coming through the window. And he gets up out of bed. He has to do this somehow. He's now able to move as if he's under someone's control. Goes to the window, and here are these small figures. And they take him right through the glass, magically. How that operates, we don't know. Into the craft, and up a beam of light. Now, this craft is hovering, let's say, on the 3rd story level in a suburban area, but nobody saw it, obviously. In the craft, he's taken in a room, he's examined, sampling was done, sperm sample was taken, various things were done, which happen almost regularly in these cases. And then, after this is all over, he's taken back out into a kind of hallway in the craft, and he said there's a kind of bench. And I asked him to describe the bench. He said, it's like the wall melted. It just came down as a piece like that. It's like, so he's sitting there, and he's being made to sit there, naked. And he hears someone coming. He doesn't know what's going to happen. He's very frightened and in sort of a very weird state. He hears someone's coming, and coming around this curving corridor are 2 small gray figures holding up his friend, the drunken boy, whose house he ended up in. And he looks and he said, oh, that's whatever this fellow's name is. He recognizes him from this party that had happened only a few hours before. He said, he looks awful. He looks strange. What's the matter with him? And he said, there's something on his shirt. He said, I think he threw up on his David Bowie t-shirt. And the aliens have him stand up and go with them, and they go out this corridor, and the drunken boy and Stephen and the 2 aliens go down a beam of light, and they're in a bedroom. And this turns out to be now his friend's, the drunken friend's bedroom. And at that point, the aliens sort of hand him this poor drunken abductee, 16-year-old, and he does the manly thing. He helps the boy take his filthy clothes off, puts him in bed. The aliens are standing there watching. Perhaps they've never dealt with a drunk before, although that would seem amazing. And he does this little touching thing to look for a wastebasket or something to put next to the bed in case he's sick again. Then the aliens come over to him and take him down this flight of stairs, and this is by floating. He's only so far off the floor. And he's put in the bed that he woke up in the morning. Now, the interesting thing about this case to me, which is apart from the fact that how does one explain how this kid got from one house to another, never been in the other house in his life, and it's 3 miles away, and he was stark naked, and it was a march. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Apart from that, which is, of course, very important, is you feel in this particular case, the aliens were concerned about this drunken boy not knowing how to take care of him or what his condition was going to be, and maybe they thought he was ill or whatnot, and they didn't want anything more to do with it, so they handed it over to his buddy, who was also an abductee that night. So, at any rate, the thing about that case, of course, is that the UFO could not have, the abduction could not have taken place, either parts of it, if this thing were seeable. This happened in the suburbs of London, Croydon. And of course, it shows some kind of alien understanding for the conditions of a boy who's had too much to drink or whatever they thought had caused this. And so they got his friend to do the honors to take him home, which shows, in a certain sense, some kind of concern, which is rather nice to think about. These sorts of cases turn up all the time. People have returned from UFO abduction experiences wearing someone else's clothes, because when they're stripped in the craft and examined, and assuming there's a pile of clothes on the floor, when they're dressed, they have somebody else's clothes on. And a woman I worked with was very proud of her new Victoria's Secret nightgown, which is very slinky. And when she woke up in the morning with some memories of what's happened, she was wearing this big, bulky, green man's T-shirt, and which made us wonder how he woke up in the morning. But the point is that mistakes are made. The alien species, race, whatever we want to call it, are like humans. We make mistakes. We put the wrong person in the wrong house, or we do something like this with the clothing. I've had many cases where someone turns up in the wrong clothes. And I've got an interesting little collection of things. We would always like to hope we can find the person who originally owned these things. But these sorts of things happen, showing that there's no supermind here that is totally efficient. The mental powers, the ability that they have to control things, as I say, to float you through a closed wall, or pop you right out, abduct somebody in the middle of Paris, daytime. All of these things are just staggering, and also control your behavior to some extent. These things seem to be going on, and they're part of a pattern. The patterns are extraordinarily similar. And what I'm going to do is, in just a moment, we'll take a break, and after the break, I want to show you this tape about this very, very fascinating crash retrieval case. And I'll go back in the book table. Incidentally, I was very pleased by the kind remarks that Jeff made about my being an artist, because I think in the art world there are a lot of people that I don't know that I do this kind of thing, you know, as if it's kind of a subversive activity of mine. But I have a double life, I brought along some examples of collages that I make. But we'll have questions after we have the tape. So let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll be back. Thank you. Thank you. And she and her husband, and had met this very interesting little lady who had come to the meeting because she had begun to remember an experience that she felt she had to deal with, that she wanted to talk to somebody. She had seen some video footage of starving children in Somalia or something like that. And they looked to have very large heads because the body was so emaciated. And she suddenly remembered something that she'd sort of tried to put out of her mind for years, seeing these little bodies back when she was a young woman in her 20s, a medical technician at a hospital, small hospital in northern New Mexico. And so my friends had me get in touch with her, and I eventually went down there and made a couple of trips dealing with her. Now, story that she told, and we'll let her tell it in her own words on tape, but essentially it was this, that she rode in the ambulance whenever there was a call, an emergency. It was a tiny little hospital. You will see it, cement brick building. And as I mentioned at the beginning, that they'd received a call that there was an accident. That was all, nothing was explained, and the directions how to get there. And she and the ambulance owner, or his son, she couldn't remember, it was the father's son, one or the other would drive the ambulance. They went out, and that's where they saw these state troopers' cars parked up in the field. It's a pretty barren area, there's nothing there. And when they drove up, that's when they got out of the ambulance and saw these bodies. And she asked, as I mentioned, you know, where are their parents? Well, at any rate, what happened very quickly is that they bundled up the bodies and took them, two of them on a gurney and the other one on a stretcher, put them in the back of the ambulance, took them back to the hospital, and the state troopers had alerted the Air Force at that point. Now, these are people who were, and this was, you know, in the 60s. I believe the year was 66 now. This was a time when, of course, the Cold War was in full swing, the war in Vietnam. These people were very patriotic. And so what happened was when the Air Force showed up at the hospital and came in and removed the bodies, which she had already x-rayed, they took the x-rays. They took every scrap of everything you could imagine there that pertained to this incident. And they were told, this did not happen. You are not to remember it. The government has a long arm. They were quite intimidated. And apparently the bodies were only viewed by the doctor, who's no longer alive, at the hospital herself, the ambulance driver, who seems to have been, if it was the father, also no longer living. But in terms of trying to run down other people, and there seems to be one loose witness we're still trying to locate. In trying to run down any possibilities here, we visited the widow of the man who owned the ambulance, who was probably the one who drove the ambulance. And this widow, even though her husband never told her anything about the incident, because he was warned in the same way, she said that she well remembers that that afternoon the Air Force showed up and stripped the ambulance of everything on the back inside, any sheet, object, piece of paper, anything. And she said, I remember we never got paid by anybody for making the run on top of that. She was a very believable witness, and her son, the son of could have been one of the ambulance drivers, but it turns out wasn't, said that at the time he moonlighted as a police dispatcher, and he remembers talk at the time of alien bodies. So there is a surrounding group of people who can attest to at least parts of this. So if we can have the tape now, you will see the beanie story. This is not something that has been finished in an absolute way. My wife is working on this as a videotape. Okay, thank you. We're the technician who rode in the ambulance, just normally.
Yeah.
A phone call, like the phone call for this incident, would have come to the hospital from the police, is that right?
Yeah.
And then they just told you what? What do you remember they said that this was?
They just said there'd been an accident.
And you had no idea that there was anything unusual about
No.
this? Mm-hmm.
But we had to walk a half a mile up to the...
Would you have a kind of a wheeled gurney?
Yeah. Yeah.
So then and what you were looking at when you were walking towards it, what were you seeing exactly?
Just prairie as far as I'm
But I mean, you saw two police cars, is that
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
And then when I got up there, you could see this craft kind of crying out. It looked like when it come down, one half of it was just just into the mountain,
Mm-hmm.
and the other half was sticking out.
Uh-huh. And the first thing you saw then beyond that were the bodies?
Yeah, because they were, I guess the state policeman had pulled them out. They were laying on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, I thought it was 3 children when I first walked up there, and I said, well, where are the parents? Did they go for help? And they said, no, we don't know what we've got here. And when I couldn't find a pulse or a blood pressure or anything on them, I said, let's go back to town. I don't know what we've got either. So we loaded them up and went back to town. This used to be the emergency entrance.
Well, it says emergency there. You think that's about where they brought them in before?
Yeah, that's where we are.
Okay, well, let's pull up there so you can. When you pulled in, you removed the gurney. Did you go into the ER or into
No,
the...
straight into the X-ray.
Straight in the X-ray.
Said that little sister of something come after us because things, number one, I come on with 2 on a stretcher.
Yeah.
And I didn't usually do that.
Yeah.
And she was pretty curious as to what was going on.
Yeah.
And then Dr. Galvin come in, and he was the one that examined them.
And how tall would you say they would have been? You said children. Let's have a...
I'd say that they were between 3 and 4 feet high.
And let's get into a little description now. What
I remember.
First, how badly damaged did they?
They were burned. And remember I told you about they had kind of their suits or their coveralls or whatever you want to call them, was made out of something like awning or something. We couldn't cut it with bandage scissors, and the only way we got it, Dutch had a knife, and we got it nicked in and ripped it. And they did not have ears per se, and they did not have noses per se. They had orifices, and that's about it.
Were their faces badly burnt?
One of them was really, you could see a whole one if you put the 3 of them together.
Right.
You know what I'm trying to say?
Exactly, yeah. And was the flesh blackened from the fire?
Oh, yeah.
It really was.
Now, where they had the suits on, we don't know because when we come off with the suits, their flesh had been so cooked that part of it come off with the suits.
Yeah. Let's take the limbs, the hand, the arms and fingers.
I only had 3 fingers. They didn't have a thumb. They just had like 3, about like that, hanging down.
Were they shorter or longer, the same size as humans?
No, they weren't as long as humans. They were more stubby, and they just hung, more or less.
And I don't imagine you got to look at their feet.
Yeah, their feet was built kind of the same way, but now their feet all were burned.
Yeah.
But it looked like they had 3 appendages instead of 5 or 6 or whatever.
How long do you think it took the Air Force to get there after you brought them in? And
the police operator, or the dispatcher, called the hospital, and he said, I've already notified the Air Force I'll be here in so many minutes. And right then, I thought, oh, hell. You know, because when they come in, they demand your full attention. They don't care what you've got going otherwise, you know. But because we weren't back at the hospital very long, I bet they broke speed limit. Because by the time they pulled up they brought 1 staff car from Clovis, they brought 2 staff cars and an 18-wheeler out of Albuquerque. I remember that because they just took over the whole back.
Well, how do you know they came from Albuquerque?
Because they said they were.
Oh, they said they were.
Some of them, they all come in and showed their ID and all. I got irritated with them when they started picking stuff up because they even, well, they wanted even my x-ray. They wanted to take the wet x-rays, and I said, no, let me get them dry. This was back in the days before automatic processors and dryers and stuff. So I got them dry. You know, well, you've been in the Texaco warehouse. We used to park the ambulances down underneath there where those big garage doors were. They even went down there and they picked up everything they could, even the sheets that I had over the bodies. They didn't leave us nothing.
But the ambulance company was owned by the Johnsons? And what kind of an ambulance was it?
It was a 63 Ford converted station wagon. Back then, all we had, you know, it's not a rolling emergency room
Yes,
like
right.
they've got now.
Yeah.
Back then, we had a lot of speed and a little bit of oxygen, and that was all. I mean, they had a hole and everything.
How did they move the bodies from the,
Like I said, they had like a rock box, and they brought the boxes in and loaded them right off of my x-ray table, right into these boxes, and took the boxes out to the 18-wheeler.
what were the boxes that were they just like a simple?
Well, yeah, like a rough box that you would put the casket in, you know what I'm...
Right.
But it looked like something they were used to doing.
This is an extremely important thing. It really is important if it happened. Do you remember what we came here for before?
About the airplane.
Yeah, right.
The crash
No.
and either your husband or your son was driving the ambulance that Danny was.
We never decided which one was driving.
Probably so.
No, I think it was Jimmy, and I think Walter scared him so bad with that tape recorder and all, he didn't want to admit it.
As I remember before, you said you remembered some conversation.
Well, I remember, of course, I kept books, and
Well, remember the last time we were here, Jimmy took us down to the warehouse and he let us get your old journal out, you know, your log run. And I still say there's 2 pages missing.
well, it's all gone now. I sold the warehouse.
Oh, you did? Who's got it now?
Gilbert Compost, the one that has the grocery store.
Oh, okay. So we both remember about Rudolph. He got so upset because he thought the Air Force overstepped their bounds, didn't he? Remember?
Yes, and I remember that.
Uh-huh.
You remember that
I
the Air
remember
Force,
him talking about it.
Yeah.
that they were, what were they doing that you remember that he
Only that he
objected to?
said, you know, I think the Air Force came in and took over and they
Oh, yeah, they picked that
So they didn't
ambulance
let
clean.
them. And went all through the ambulance and everything. But I just remember that he was upset.
He was upset about
Well,
that.
remember, I never started to chart until I got back here to where there was a doctor. I just used scrap paper. Boy, they cleared that out in a minute, didn't they?
But do you remember anybody saying anything about aliens,
No.
bodies?
I don't remember any of that. Just, you know, keeping the books and Rudolph talking about, just, you know, he didn't think they had any business just coming in. And
Why did he think, or why did you think the Air Force
I didn't give it another thought.
had gone through
I
the
was so
ambulance?
used to these
Weird
wrecks,
situations.
you know, and he and Jimmy discussing it, but it didn't.
But he asked him, is that it for records, to see if he had anything?
Well, they did take the trip ticket, remember?
Yeah, they did get that.
Yeah, they took, and that's when he really got upset. He said, how am I supposed to claim to Uncle Sam I even made
And I
this
don't
trip?
think we ever collected. I don't think we didn't have anybody to send a bill to.
Yeah.
'Cause they
But did he say to you why he thought the Air Force
No.
was doing this?
Not to me. And I know they might have been sitting there, but
You-
not particularly interested.
You know, Mr. Johnson, I, of course, didn't know your husband or anything,
Well,
but I'm
believe me,
curious.
he was a fine man.
Yeah, I'm curious.
But he was also a man that he kept everything. I mean, you almost had to pry something out of him if you wanted it, didn't you?
Well, that's what I'm asking.
He and Jimmy, we just didn't.
But like I said, if you'd have known Rudolph, he was a man, when he found out something, if he'd been told, it don't go no farther.
Yeah.
It don't go no farther, including
That
his
that was
wife.
the way he was. And
Yeah.
You know, if this happened last year, it'd be different.
Yeah.
We're talking a long time ago.
But,
Yeah, 34 years ago.
you know, everybody has said the same thing I have said. Everybody that's tracking stuff down has said the same thing I did. The Air Force really gives you a false idea that they've got all the control of everything. I noticed.
It's the threat of control that works with them. It's
Yeah.
not having control.
I mean, I never will forget that guy standing there. He had scrambled eggs on his hat and a chest full of ribbons. And his name was Hickman, Higby or something like that. I can't remember.
Do you know what rank?
Colonel.
He was a colonel, full-bird colonel. I never will forget that. That's the one that said, when he walked out the back door, I never will forget, he turned about halfway back around and he said, "Today has never happened. We have never been here. You're supposed to forget everything that has occurred today, and don't forget the government has a long arm."
Did he give any reason why he was saying that?
No, he didn't.
Did he say?
I guess he thought no explanation necessary.
Yeah.
I was young enough that I didn't question it when they told me to
Yeah.
keep my mouth shut,
Right.
you know.
Yeah.
So,
But how about you talking about it with anybody?
that's what I said.
Or Dr. Galvin?
It got to where, I mean, well, after that bird colonel standing there,
Yeah.
I don't know whether it was fear, whether it was just we didn't want to think about it, you know, you kind of out of mind, out of sight, out of
Yeah.
mind, you know, or what. But no, we never discussed it.
Uh-huh. Do you think that's odd?
Yes, well, I told you that before, I thought
Yeah.
it was. Because usually when we've had a unusual or a bad smash up or something,
Yeah.
we talk about it for 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah.
But we didn't this time. And it was almost like a silent consent that everybody just shut their mouth about it.
Higley or Higby or Hickman?
Something like that.
Smith is tough.
Yeah.
But
Sandia couldn't find Corso.
after they had gone down and picked the ambulance clean and come back, and because I told them, you ain't taking they wanted my x-rays wetting on the hangers. I said, no, I'm not giving you the hangers. You come back after when the x-rays are dry. Oh, well, they went out to the site and we went out to the site later. And I mean, they had picked it clean.
You mean you and Jimmy went out, or you and somebody?
Well, you know, we tend to forget that the government, the Air Force in particular, because of the nature of the beast, has rapid recovery teams ready to go to locations where there are airplane crashes, because there may be classified equipment on board.
Well,
Ready to go where there are truck crashes with sophisticated equipment, nuclear stuff, all kinds of things. And there are people whose job it is, just as described in SOM 1.01, is to pick up, clean up,
Everything,
get
yeah.
rid of.
Let's look a little differently at this. So we've got her, but we also have the sheriff's family, I mean the cops and everything. Who else?
Oh, the druggers.
Okay, there's Target.
But that's a target, and you see.
And with a nice name.
Yeah, wasn't he connected with the police department at some point?
no.
He wasn't.
Manuel Ulebury was sheriff. And then
That's what we're looking for.
And then Manuel's younger brother, I believe his name is Trini Ulebury,
How do you
was
spell that last name?
ULIBRR. Let's see.
I think that's it. As so far, we can have the lights. Now, this is, I say, is a work in progress that my wife's been working on, and we were trying to find some more information. I just want to say one thing about her credibility. She remembered the name of the police officer, state police officer, who she knew well. She called him Dutch on the tape, who was there recovering the bodies. And when she went to this MUFON meeting and met the folks who passed the story on to me, the husband at that meeting of the woman who I'd worked with was a retired state police officer, and she immediately asked him, did you know Dutch, whatever his name was? And he said, yes, I knew him somewhat. And she said, I've got to find him because he was there. And they started a search for this Dutch. Now, when you make up a story, you don't say, so-and-so was there, and I want to try to find him. Because if you find him, the guy said, what are you talking about? I don't remember anything like that. You're in a spot. But she was definite, and she became a kind of tigress trying to find, locate this man Dutch. And what happened actually was when they did locate him, he's long since retired, He was in the hospital with a heart attack. And she wanted to go to the hospital and interview him in the hospital room, which we wish had happened. And before that could happen, he passed away. And she ended up going to the funeral, and even though she hadn't seen him for years and years, trying to talk to his widow to see what she could find out. So this is a woman who gave us the name of the man who was there and really, really tried to run him down and said he was the state police officer in charge. So it's another sign of her credibility. Now you can make up your own mind about what you think about Beanie. She's an odd lady, but and she did not want the Air Force to take her wet X-rays out of there or the hangars, which is just one of those little details which is not self-glorifying, but granted her personality is something you can imagine she would very easily have said. Now we have just a couple of minutes for questions here. I think they're going to come in and clean up the place in a few minutes, so I'm sorry we've gone a little over time. Any questions about any of this? Yeah, question. If you could come over, that's, yeah. We could have a microphone there, so it can be recorded. Sorry for the arrangement here, but we'll try to make this quick, okay?
Okay, I'd like to know if you can identify certain kind of patterns as to the people that they choose to abduct.
Good, very good question. The patterns that people choose to abduct. As far as I can tell, I've never seen any patterns at all. And this is, the people cross every kind of ethnic, sexual preference, age, financial education, all those levels, all around the world. What is important, though, is people who have abduction experiences, because they're shaped by these experiences from childhood on. There are certain habits of mind and issues that come up which abductees tend to share. But those seem to be the result of their experiences and not the reason they were chosen in the first place. It's kind of a chicken and the egg thing. Abductees generally have a lot of problems sleeping. They have a lot of problems with unusual fears, some of which seem extremely irrational. A woman, for instance, describing that she had a lifelong fear, well, as a child, she had many years of fear that she couldn't go up in a building higher than 3 floors because she felt she could fall through the floor. And she was in dread. And I said, well, you mean you were afraid the building would collapse? And she said, no, that I would fall through the floor. And I said, well, how can that happen? And she said, somehow I knew that I'd gone through walls, so I thought if I'm in a tall building, why didn't I just go through the floor? Now, where does a fear like that come from unless maybe you've gone through a wall? So these odd fears are part of it, but there are many kinds of symptoms that I think you can tell with people who've had this kind of experience, because it's very traumatic. I mean, one is paralyzed, can't move, you don't know what's happening. As a little child, you don't know whether you're ever going to be brought back again, you know, and so on and so forth. And these are going to be experiences that are going to shape a lot of your behavior. Now, do we have another question? Anybody, question? You want to come over?
Do the abductions happen as frequently as in the 60s and 70s? My impression was that they are not doing as much experiment and abductions nowadays.
Well, as many as in the 60s and 70s. Well, actually, in terms of what we knew about abductions, we only knew of one from the 60s in a general sense that the public knew. That was the Betty Barney Hill case, which happened in 61. And in the 70s, there was the Pascagoula abduction in 73, and then a few years later, Travis Walton and a few others. So we didn't even know there were many at all in the 60s or 70s. In retrospect now, we can look back and many people have come forward with experiences from then. But I do think that there are extremely common experiences still going on. And I've certainly looked into abductions in the past 2 months. I've looked into some events that happened in the past few months. I mean, the abductions took place, so I think it's still very common. It's a good question. I think maybe we have time for one more question here. One more, and then, yeah.
I am curious to know if you've looked into any literature that has been written by people such as Ashiana Dean in the Voyager series, Allies of Humanity, Marshall Summers, or Philip Croft, Contact Has Begun?
Different books that I've read or familiar with. I have to say that I'm not familiar, I've heard the names, but I'm not familiar with those books. In general, I'm not drawn to channeled material, and there are lots of books of ostensibly channeled material. I think that most channeled material is difficult to check on, and some of it might be very appealing, but it's very hard to know what you have. And of course, the problem is every channeler says that they have the correct channel and the other people don't listen to them. So you've got, a lot of problems. I try to work with cases where there's some sort of physical evidence, some kind of testimony which connects with patterns that I'm very familiar with. And there's a great deal of material out there about the phenomenon, some of which really is about the phenomenon, and some is more about the particular psyches of the people who've written the material, so it's very hard to tell. So I have to sort of take a pass on that question. But at any rate, I know that it's late, and I really thank everybody for their attention. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bud. Thank you, Jeff Rense, for the introduction. Thank you all for coming. Sasha Lithman next Tuesday at the library. Please grab a calendar on your way out if you didn't get one already. Good night.